All right, thanks for that, Sean. I'm glad you all could make it. I'm going to be talking a little bit about bees in Vermont and bee conservation and some work that I've been doing for the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. So for those of you not familiar, VCE is a small nonprofit in Norwich that does a lot of work all over Vermont, but also globally, some work in the Caribbean, and primarily focused with birds, but more and more branching out into other organisms and ecosystems. This project that I'm currently working on is a sub-project of the Vermont Atlas of Life in the upper right there, and sort of spawned off of work that started in 2012 with a bumblebee survey. Many of you might have heard about the Bumblebee Atlas that we did, a couple of years of field work throughout the state to get a sense of the distribution and abundance of the 17 bumblebee species that are known from Vermont. And Sean, can people see my cursor if I want to point things out?
Yeah, we can see your cursor, but there is a little bit of lag, so you might just want to hover your mouse over things for a little while.
Great. All right. So enough about that. So I'm sure all of you have heard of bees and are somewhat familiar with some bees. Chances are you know the honeybee pretty well. It's in all intents and purposes in Vermont, it's an agricultural animal. It's native to Asia and parts of Eastern Europe. It's been widely domesticated, spread all over the world, and in Vermont, it only exists in managed hives. So people's backyards, on farms, anywhere where people set up a honeybee hive. That's what that is, Apis mellifera, the western honeybee. I'm not going to be talking a lot about that because it's been well studied, it's well known, and it's very widespread. What I'm going to be talking about today is the rest of the bees in Vermont. So bees they're insects. They're in the order Hymenoptera, along with wasps and ants and a bunch of other things. They fall out taxonomically into this, we call it epifamily. There's 7 families, 6 of which have representatives in Vermont. All bees can be distinguished from all other insects, at least in the order Hymenoptera, by the presence of branched hairs somewhere on their body. So these are often microscopic things that even with a good microscope are hard to see, but they relate more to the natural history of bees. The vast majority of bees, again, there's a lot of exceptions to just about everything, but most of the bees in Vermont feed their offspring pollen, which is a protein source for the young bees to develop on and sets them apart from a lot of the other Hymenoptera that are feeding their offspring animal protein. So wasps are collecting caterpillars, scavengers even, but bees are only collecting pollen and nectar to feed their developing young. And bees in Vermont range from this tiny little lasioglossum that would fit inside of a jewelweed flower to the big bumblebees and carpenter bees that many of you may be familiar with from your backyard. And I'm going to be touching on diversity of these bees across the state and some work that was done in this past summer in 2019 in Chittenden County. So within this epifamily of bees, there's a lot of different natural histories. Roughly 20% are pollen specialists, meaning they collect and feed their young pollen from a narrow range of plants. Often it's a genus, sometimes it's a single species of flower, sometimes it's a family, but that's the only pollen source they will need. And then my personal fascination is with these roughly 25% of all Vermont species are parasitic, or I guess the proper term would be kleptoparasitic, meaning that they take over the nest of other bees, lay their egg in the pollen resources that are devoted to the host species, and then in the following season out comes this kleptoparasitic bee. This is an example on the right here. On the picture is a nomata, probably the most abundant genus of kleptoparasite in Vermont. And I'll touch on a few more of them throughout the presentation. it's a fascinating group, and for a lot of reasons. In addition to the 25% that are parasitic, something like 12% are cavity nesters in stems and branches and shrubs and forbs, or in bee hotels, which I'll talk about and I can send some links out to afterwards. And then there's at least 9 invasive bees known from Vermont, and probably going to be more in the near future. The current project we've been calling VTBs. It's the Vermont Wild Bee Survey. We've been going all over the state to try and find historical insect collections at universities and museums to really catalog all of the bees that have been collected in Vermont, and then also to collect a bunch of our own. And starting in 2019, but we've got at least 2 more years of this project ahead of us to get a good sense of all of the bees that are here. Believe it or not, there's never been a comprehensive species list of the bees of Vermont published. No one really has a good sense of how many species are here. When we started this project, the back of the envelope calculation was roughly 275 species, but even that was pretty sketchy. And now, after a full year of fieldwork and identifying of old historical specimens, we think the list is closer to 350. And hopefully, relatively shortly, we'll have that finalized and published, but it's a work in progress. And we're finding new species all the time. So once we have this list, we want to start to make some meaningful conclusions with it. We want to make these things that are called S ranks, sort of an assessment of the rarity of a species. They're used for all organisms, plants, insects, birds, you name it. But we want to do this for bees, which is sort of, it's a simplified way of measuring the current abundance, the distribution, and then the trends over time of species. So a rapidly declining species is going to get a high priority S rank, an S1 per se, whereas a widespread common species will be a low priority, like an S5. The rank goes from 1 to 5. So we need to do that. We need to come up with these trends. We need to find all the historical specimens, figure out which ones were here historically, which ones are here now, see how things have changed as best we can. We want to know where these species are distributed in Vermont, what their habitat requirements are, what percentage of the suitable habitat they're occupying. Obviously, there's a lot to this that is going to take a lot of time, but we're making good progress, and yeah, it's been a really cool process. And we also want to not just do this ourselves, but we want to engage the public as much as possible. We had a lot of great volunteers this past summer. We've got more lined up for this coming summer, and then outreach through this and things like the Vermont Atlas of Life on iNaturalist are really what's going to make this project stand out in terms of conservation impact.
Hey, Spencer, can I just quickly interject?
Yeah.
I should have mentioned this at the beginning. If folks have any questions, you're welcome to type it into the chat box. If you're on a desktop or a laptop right now, somewhere up towards the top right is a little comment box you can click open and put in a question there. And I'll go ahead and moderate those questions and ask them of Spencer throughout if you'd like.
Yeah, feel free to shout out questions, Sean, as they come up. I'm happy to stop and talk more about things that don't make sense or whatnot. So we've been using this thing called GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, to store and to share our data. So all the data that we've collected will be public. We're in the process of cleaning up those data sets. This is an example of the inset is the Middlebury College insect collection, which we had a chance to go through, pull out all the bees, identify them, georeference them, and now they are all published on GBIF, and they have this clean, unique data set that you can see here. Starting in the 60s, there's a big spike in 1969 when one professor was doing a lot of collection, and then sort of scattered throughout. And then early 2000s, there was another professor doing a lot of bee research who's since retired. But this just shows the value of these historical collections and the issues with doing this kind of data analysis. Like here, you don't have any specimens from 10 years in the 1990s from this collection. So it's going to be a challenge to make these trend lines, but it is the data that we have, and there's not likely to be other sources. And then the background graph is all bees records in GBIF starting about 2000. So the scales are obviously very different on these two. And the Middlebury College hardly registers as a blip in here. But what does show up is the VCE's Bumblebee Atlas, the roughly 12,000 specimens collected in 2012 and 2013 as part of that work. We now have a really good sense of the distribution and trends of the 17 bumblebee species, which is now down to 13 as some of them have been extirpated. That's a whole nother talk I could give at some point, but we're starting to build this large data set on GBIF of all the known bee records for Vermont. So if you know of anyone that has a personal bee collection hiding out in their basement somewhere, we'd love to get our hands on it and to make a data set out of it. In 2019, myself and a few other VCE staff did a lot, and not to mention the 12 really dedicated volunteers that we had that were all over Chittenden County collecting bees. We're using nets, we're using these things called bee bowls, which are little traps of soapy water that passively collect a lot of the smaller bees that are hard to spot and even harder to catch with a net. Collected something like 8,000 specimens that we are in the process of working with, which is, I think I'll talk about in a second. We've also been working with other groups, UVM, some other people that have been doing bee work in the state and trying to tie the work together to help each other out and to get more data on the state's bees. Collecting the bees turns out to be the easy part. A lot of the work and a lot of the time and effort that makes this kind of stuff so hard is the lab work. And as you can see here, this is most of our bee collection from 2019 spread out on a big table in the VCE office. I'm at the point where I can sort most of the specimens by genus, but going much beyond that takes a well-trained expert. So there's these keys online. This one's on Discover Life, which is a great resource for those of you who want to check it out and really get into the nitty-gritty of bee identification. You're looking at things under a microscope and you're looking at minute angles in the shoulders, or the bottom one is the end of the thorax, this little triangle that has these ridges, and the percent of the triangle that's filled with the ridges is a feature on this key that then allows you to simplify out. You click on the checkbox and it simplifies out that genus even further so that you check the boxes that you know and you can see and you narrow it down. But even with a key like this, a lot of these species are really challenging. So this has been the biggest holdup in getting this work done in the past and has been a big hurdle for us at VCE to get over. I drove a car full of bees down to Maryland this past winter to get identified by an expert down there who offered to do a lot of it. And he's slowly working through them and sending them back as he finishes. Hopefully he'll be done in the next couple months. And at that point, we'll have the full list ready to publish.
Spencer, a question from one of our younger naturalists in the crowd. How often do y'all get stung by bees in your collecting process?
I think I was stung 2 or 3 times this past summer. Once was a wasp that I stepped on their nest. And the other 2 were bees that I was handling in a net and was a little too quick and they got me. But in general, bees are not aggressive. They're unlikely to sting you unless you're messing with their nest. And even then, only the social bees, the honeybees and the bumblebees, are likely to sting you defensively. Occasionally, the smaller bees will sting you if you were to grab them, but a lot of the species are so small and their stingers are so weak that they won't penetrate your skin. So when people talk about bee stings, probably 75 to 90% of those are actually coming from wasps, with ground yellow jackets being the main culprit. You step on a nest, you run your lawnmower over a nest, they come swarming out and they attack you because they're defending a group resource. Because most of these bees are solitary, they are unlikely, they don't have anything to defend. So their only goal is to survive themselves. So they're not going to go out of their way to sting you unless they really have to. So now I've got a couple stories about rare bees that we found this summer that I'll touch on here. This is one, the Canadian cellophane cuckoo bee. This was caught by a VC, the current VC data technician, Nathaniel Sharp, at Colchester this past summer. It's one of the cellophane cuckoo bees, meaning that it's a kleptoparasite on the cellophane bees, which is a genus Eccostudies. And this species in particular, we weren't sure about. Nathaniel posted it on iNaturalist, and within a day, the world bee expert had chimed in and identified it as the Canadian cellophane cuckoo bee. And it leaves a note here saying it's the first record for New England. Turns out it's a very rare bee that hadn't been collected in, I think, the past 30 years anywhere in the world. It's in historical collections, but it's always been rare, and no one's been doing this kind of work. This work hasn't been happening enough for it to show up. It doesn't mean that it's extinct or that it's endangered necessarily. It's just very rarely collected. In part because its host, the Eccostudies here, is also likely pretty rare, and people just don't spend a lot of time staring at Eccostudies nests waiting for these cuckoos to show up. So obviously a lot of what VC does and what I'm interested in is conservation of these bees, and we need to have the list to know that to begin a lot of the conservation efforts. We also want to think about what are our conservation priorities, and this is something that there's no right answer to, but it's a good thought exercise for anyone that's interested in conservation, really of any sort. But bees are just an interesting case study in this because they're such great pollinators and they have measurable economic value. So we could be interested in really rare species like that cuckoo bee on the last slide, and we want to preserve them. Or we could try and preserve the economically valuable species that are doing the majority of the crop pollination. There may or may not be overlap between those two groups. Or we could try and preserve as many species as possible and really protect the biodiverse regions. Another option would be to focus on what's called ecosystem integrity, so the number of trophic levels, the resiliency, and the diversity within the bee ecosystem. And then finally, another alternative would be climax species, which are the species that are present in an undisturbed habitat, which in Vermont would be an old growth hardwood or mixed hardwood softwood forest. There's no right answer, but it's something we've been thinking about. And these two pictures here are an interesting case study. This is both of these were taken seconds apart. It's the same individual. This is Melissoides bimaculata, the two-spotted longhorn bee. In the picture on the squash flower, you can see two tiny little white spots on the end of its abdomen where it gets its name. This was the first documentation of this species in Vermont this past summer in my yard in Richmond. And it was visiting both my cucumbers and then seconds later my peas, providing what we call an ecosystem service in pollination. But also it's a uncommon species in Vermont. We've since found it elsewhere, but certainly not widespread. And given how distinctive it is, I think we would know if it was common here in the past. For some reason, I'm not advancing. People still hear me?
Yeah, I can still hear you, Spencer.
Something may have froze because I can't advance to my next slide.
You can try stopping your presentation and starting it again.
I can't even see my mouse.
Oh, that's
worst case scenario, I can answer a bunch of questions for a while I figure this out.
Well, if you're able to multitask better than your computer can, one question that we're getting is, are rare species actually rare, or is it just that not many people are looking for them?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and there's depends a little bit on the species that we're talking about. There certainly are rare bees. The one that's often cited as the rarest species in the state, or rarest species of bee in the world. I don't even think it has a common name, but it's a kleptoparasite of the genus Macropus, which is a specialist on the yellow loosestrifes, which are a native group of flowers. And there are Macropus in Vermont, and this Coleoptoparasite has likely been in Vermont, but Macropus has been declining for unknown reasons, and because this Coleoptoparasite requires Macropus, it's never going to be as abundant as its host, and has likely declined as a result of declines in its host. It was thought to be extinct briefly, and then was rediscovered in New Hampshire, Connecticut, and maybe a couple other states. But you could look for years and never find that bee, even though it may be here, just incredibly rare. Other bees are much less rare and just underreported, or people just aren't looking for them.
Speaking of looking for bees, while you're getting back to where you were, another question from Alan is if there's any trick for finding bees in the woods.
Yeah. So there's a whole swath of bees that really like spring ephemerals, or that specialize in spring ephemerals. There's a Andrina bee that only uses trout lily. There's a spring beauty specialist. So finding the flowers is a great way to find those bees. But in general, when I'm out in the field trying to collect bees, I'm not necessarily just going to flowers. I'm also looking for nest sites, which ties nicely into this next slide that I have here. Can people see it? We back?
Yeah. I think we're back up and running.
Yeah, great. So my next slide was going to talk about things that we can do to conserve bees. One of which being nest sites. Flowers obviously get a lot of attention as the resource that we can create to get bees, to promote bees in our neighborhood, in our backyard. But nest sites are often limiting and are therefore important for conservation. And for the nest sites obviously depend on the species of bee, but something like 75% of the bees in the state are ground nesters. They're nesting in bare ground or semi-bare ground where they can dig in or find existing burrows. And sand in particular is easy for them to dig. So a lot of bees really need a sandy area for their nests. So you can even create little sandboxes in your backyard. And by keeping the soil bare, you're going to get some species that are able to dig into any kind of soil, but a little, maybe 2x2 square foot of sand will attract probably new species to your yard. And that's also a great place to look for rare bees. So we've had that Coletes example, that cellophane cuckoo bee example that I was talking about earlier that Nathaniel found up in Colchester. That bee was searching for the nest of its host in a patch of bare sand at Airport Park where we had seen a lot of Coletes a couple days before, so we went back to try and find more bees there. And we just stood there and we watched as these bees were coming in and out of their holes, and we were looking for these Coleoptoparasites that were attracted to the nesting aggregation. There were no flowers anywhere to be seen. And just by standing there and really looking for different things coming in, we were able to find some really cool bees. So that's one way to search, especially for the Coleoptoparasites. The 25% of bees that are cavity nesters can be attracted using bee hotels, which if people are interested, I can put a link in the comments as soon as I'm done. There's a lot of information online about them, but either straws or holes in wood blocks that bees can nest in. Be a little careful with them because they can also attract a lot of parasites, diseases, and things that are not great for the bees. So you want to keep them clean and keep them rotated. So look it up before you build willy-nilly, but that's a good way to attract bees and to monitor bees in an area. Other things that you can do around your home to conserve bees: reduce mowing. Lawns have little to offer in terms of floral diversity and to biodiversity in general. Shrubby areas are great. A lot of the native shrubs that'll come back in a field that hasn't been mowed for a few years, like sumac or elderberry or raspberries, these all have a lot of value to bees, both as a flower and as a nesting site. And the stems of elderberry or in raspberries that have been cut or broken off. And then small farms and the local diverse farms that we have in Vermont turn out to be really valuable for a lot of bee species. I did a lot of collecting in the Intervale in Burlington. For those of you familiar, it's a relatively large floodplain that's been converted to a small-scale agriculture, sort of an incubator farm for, there's probably a half dozen different farms down there. There's a lot of hedgerows, a lot of different crops, and it's an open area that has a good diversity of flowers year-round, or season long, and that was where I found the highest diversity of bees this past summer. And then the other thing that we appreciate is any data that you can collect. Pictures on iNaturalist in your backyard are great and a really easy way to contribute data to this project.
Spencer, do you have any recommendations for good flowers or shrubs to plant to promote bee diversity?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of a lot of the shrubs. So most pollinator gardens are really just focused on annuals and perennial forbs or small flowers, but a lot of the shrubs are even easier to maintain and also provide nesting sites. Elderberry's great. Sumac, I know is not the most attractive flower, but it is attractive to bees. What are the other? There's a couple other shrubs. Hawthorn. A lot of these any of the native shrubby trees that have flowers. Dogwoods. Dogwoods are spectacular. There's a couple dogwood specialists. There are lists out there. The Xerces Society does good work in providing recommendations for backyard enhancements for bee biodiversity. I don't know how much time we have left. So we got another half hour. I'm going to talk about 20 minutes. I'll talk about just a few species that are found in Vermont that are be fun ones to look for while we're stuck at home this spring and can't travel far. A lot of these can be found in backyards throughout the state, potentially. This is another one of the Ecologies, the cellophane bees. It's called the unequal cellophane bee, and I don't have the faintest clue where that name comes from. But it's probably one of the most abundant early spring bees, starting any day now through late May, early June. These bees will be out. They are most obvious where they're nesting. They're communal ground nesters. They're solitary, meaning that it's just a single female builds her hole, lays her eggs, and with her pollen balls down under a couple feet underground, where her offspring will develop over the rest of the summer and through the winter. But they're aggregate nesters, so you'll find hundreds, maybe thousands of these nests in a small area, all densely packed, maybe 6 inches apart, with females sticking their heads out and males patrolling over the open areas. They really like sparsely vegetated soil and grassy lawns where there's a lot of foot traffic, like soccer fields, playgrounds. This picture was taken in front of the Sugar Shack at Green Mountain Audubon in Huntington. There's a little mowed lawn where people are always playing Frisbee and kids are running around all summer. But for the month of May, basically, it was just swarming with these Ecologies bees. Super fun to watch. You can see the males come in trying to mate, the females guarding their holes from parasites and from, I guess, kleptoparasites as well. They're generalists, so they visit a lot of different flowers, but they have a particular affinity for red maple. For some reason, bees in general don't seem to like the sugar maple flowers, but red maple and then the smaller maples, mountain maple and striped maple, are really great bee flowers, bee plants. Another bee that, at least historically, was likely in a lot of yards in Vermont. This is Osmia lignaria, the blue orchard bee. Based off of the specimen records that we have from various collections around the state, this bee seems to be pretty widespread in Vermont. Lots of records from Montpelier, shows up in East Dorset in some collections, in Burlington. Generally a common early spring species. But in Vermont and elsewhere, there's some pretty significant declines in the last decade or so. Out of the 7,000, 8,000 bees that were collected this past summer, we only managed to find 3 of these species, Osmia lignaria, all 3 males from one day in Burlington this year. And the thought is that it's been pushed out as this non-native Osmia cornifrons, the horn-faced bee, spreads northward. This invasive species was brought into the Midwest and I think the Mid-Atlantic as a pollinator of cherries and apples. So brought in as a managed pollinator, I think maybe even by the USDA. And it's taken off and it's spread across the eastern North America. And it likely there's some mites and or maybe it's a direct competition thing where it's chased out this native bee that's closely related. So this is one to look for, and I'll be really interested if people can find it in their backyards this spring, starting any day now and again into early June. It's a relatively distinctive bee as bees go. It's the largest of the blue osmias in Vermont. There's a bunch of smaller species that are the same shiny blue. And the non-native species, Osmia cornifrons, is similarly sized but has a really distinctive orange tinge to all of its hair and doesn't have the same blue shine. So that's another one to look out for this spring. And if you end up putting out a bee hotel, or if you know where there's a bee hotel or other nest holes, these are 2 likely candidates to show up there. And both of them have been managed for commercial pollination of some of the early flowering fruit trees. Because honeybees, as honeybee keepers will know, their colony numbers don't peak until later in the season. These early flying spring bees fill in a gap in the pollination of things like apples and blueberries and cherries and elsewhere. Another one of my favorite bees, this is the broad-footed cellophane bee. It's a specialist on physalis, so tomatillos and ground cherries, both of which are grown in gardens throughout the state and on some of the small diverse farms. There's also a native physalis, the clammy ground cherry, which is not a plant that you hear a lot about, despite the fact that it's relatively widespread. It's pretty inconspicuous. It grows in and amongst grass and weedy fields or edges of agricultural areas. It's got a small yellow flower that hangs straight down and is relatively hard to find. But once you find it, chances are you'll find this bee. Just about everywhere I looked this past summer, including my backyard in Richmond, I found this Colides. And there were, prior to this work, there was only one known record from Vermont, actually collected in the North Branch community garden a few years back by another bee researcher visiting from Massachusetts. But the lack of records really just indicates the fact that no one's spending time staring at physalis plants looking for bees. It's a great activity if you're bored this spring. Plant some ground cherries and see what shows up. There's a couple other physalis specialists that are in Vermont that are less widespread, but could show up in a backyard garden. Maybe not until July or once the physalis is blooming.
A couple of
yeah.
One of them's mine and one of them's Alan's. So I'll blend these together. So a lot of these early bee species you're referring to, where do they go the rest of the year? And the other question is, how are these overwintering? Are they overwintering as adults, as larvae?
Yep. As you might guess, there's a lot of different approaches to this. So I'll start with bumblebees because we know the most about them, and they're the only genus native to Vermont that is an obligate sociality. So every year the bumblebee colonies they're social. They have workers, and then they produce drones in the fall. So starting in the fall, an existing colony will produce a bunch of queens and a bunch of males. They'll go out, they'll mate hopefully with males and queens from other colonies. The queens will be fertilized, everyone else will die, and then the queens will find a rodent burrow or other hole and warm place to get out of to spend the winter. Sometimes they're buried in leaf litter, sometimes they're down a ways into the ground. And the queen just hangs out there through the winter months and emerges in the spring. So far, there's been one report of a bumblebee this year already, but most of them won't be out till late April, early May. And then for a while, maybe a month or so, the only bumblebees you'll see are these overwintered female queens. They're big, they're distinctive, and they're gathering pollen for themselves and nectar, and then they're also bringing pollen back to start a colony. So they find a place to make a nest, they start storing provisions and eventually laying eggs. And once their first generation of workers come out, in Vermont it's usually early June, the queen then spends the rest of her life in that nest just pumping out eggs. And the workers are doing the work collecting pollen to feed the offspring. And the colony grows through the summer, and then at the end of its lifespan, produces a bunch of new queens and males. With a lot of the other bees, they're solitary, so they don't have this caste divisions. So it's just a male and a female. In some groups, the females overwinter already fertilized. In other groups, both sexes overwinter. Often the males come out a few days before the females in some species and sort of scope out the area, get things, and get out and look around. And then the females come out, the males are ready for them, they mate, and then the females start a colony. So, or start a nest. They shouldn't say colony because a lot of them aren't social, but they collect pollen and nectar, make this little ball that they bury in their nest, either in a stem or underground. They lay an egg on that ball, and then in most cases, the larvae develop over the course of the summer, and then overwinter as pupa and emerge the next season. It's kind of crazy to think that a lot of these bees, especially some of the early species, they are underground for something like 11 months out of the year. And they only are visible to us for the month or so while they're flying. Maybe it's the month of May, maybe June, depending on the species. And the rest of the year, they're grubs, basically eating stored pollen and growing, and then as pupa through the winter. There are some species that overwinter as adults, so they pupate in the fall, and then the adults find a warm place or a protected place at least to spend the winter. So a fun winter activity is to go find in your garden maybe, or somewhere nearby where there's a pithy plant that has been cut. So raspberries, mints, burdock. A lot of these plants have hollow stems or semi-hollow stems, and anywhere where they're broken or cut off, you might see a little hole in the top, and that's where a bee has dug into the pith and excavated out a place either as a nest or as an overwintering site. So that way I was able to find a few bees in the middle of winter as adults. I'd find a hole in the top of a raspberry stem, I'd bring it open, and I'd carefully slice it longitudinally, and you could find in this case, they were all Serotina, or the small carpenter bee. These tiny little shiny bluish bees that were adults and just sort of suspended in these raspberry stems. And I brought them inside, and they warmed up, and they started to move around a little bit. So they're there as adults waiting for spring, and they're one of the first to emerge also in late April or May. So there's a wide variety. Speaking of alternative lifestyles, this is the two-banded cellophane cuckoo bee on the screen here. No documented records prior to 2019, almost certainly here, but again, unlikely that anyone has looked for it. Nathaniel again collected the first one in early August this year in Colchester, and then a couple of days later, this picture of this individual here showed up on iNaturalist over in Woodstock. And like all the other species in the genus Epiolus, it is a kleptoparasite of cuckoo or cellophane bees, the Calides. And this particular species of Epiolus there's a specialist kleptoparasite on that bee in the last slide, the broad-footed cellophane bee. So it only can reproduce by finding the nest of a Coletes, or the broad-footed Coletes, and it lays an egg on the pollen ball that's intended for the host, and then the parasite larva develops over the winter, and in the spring or summer, this bee emerges instead of the Coletes host. So the record in Woodstock is kind of interesting in that, as far as there are no known records of the host bee, the broad-footed cellophane bee from Windsor County. It's obviously there because the Physalis is there, and then this kleptoparasitic bee is there. But hopefully in the next couple of years we can find those, get some records on the map for a lot of these specialist species. I think I have one. Oh, I guess that's the last of the bees, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about other insects that I find fascinating real quick. Obviously, bees are well known as important pollinators. They're certainly not the only pollinators, though. This paper that screenshotted on the right here kind of blew my mind in a lot of ways and really got me thinking about all the other insects that are of value to our ecosystems that don't get a lot of attention. Hoverflies are a family of flies, family Syrphidae. They're in Vermont. They're pretty global. And as adults, they visit flowers. They're one of the most abundant flower visitors in the state. And then their larvae are aphid predators for the most part. So this paper somehow figured out that 1 to 4 billion hoverflies are migrating across the English Channel every spring. And then those hoverflies are consuming something like 3 to 10 trillion aphids just in southern Britain alone. And I'm sure the same thing is happening here in the States. But just thinking of migrating flies and of the sheer quantities and the services that these are providing is pretty remarkable, especially given how few New York Times articles you read about the decline of hoverflies, despite the fact that they could very well be declining. And then there's a lot of other insects that are dependent on bees as for their lifestyles and for the trophic webs that bees support. The picture here is a hoverfly consuming a honeybee. From a trophic web perspective, bees can be thought of as herbivores. They're consuming plant parts, pollen and nectar, and then they're supporting a whole range of predators in a way that these kleptoparasitic bees are, in a sense, predatory or second trophic level, but also, but then there's all these other things. There's beetles, there's mites, there's a lot of different flies that consume bees in some part of their life cycle. And that's all I have for you guys today. Happy to take more questions, and also want to thank everyone that's made this work possible.
Well, as we're waiting for some more questions to come in, could you give us a quick, so since a lot of these hoverflies are bee mimics, how do you know if we're looking at a bee or a hoverfly at a flower?
Yeah, that is a challenge sometimes. Even for people that have been, even last summer I was getting confused by bees pretty regularly. In the lab, you can see that they have 4 wings, order Hymenoptera. Flies only have one set of wings, so 2 wings. But the bee body plan is so diverse that they range. They look like hummingbird moths. They look like gnats. Some of them are so small they look like any of these other insects that are on your flowers. Take pictures, scroll through iNaturalist, look at what other people identified. I find that was the easiest way to get a sense of what an insect is just to look at the options that are out there and start putting names to things, even if it's just at the family level. I don't have a good answer to that, though. Sorry.
So as some of us try to imagine the task ahead of us of trying to learn Vermont's bee diversity and the way you learn Vermont's bird diversity or plant diversity or something like that, I'm wondering, when you are out in the field and you come across a bee, how likely are you to be able to look at it and say, oh, I know exactly what that species is? Or how likely are you to look at it and say, I know that is something within this genus, and I would be hopeless to tell farther than that without a microscope?
Yeah. After a full season of doing this full time, there's probably only 20 or 30 species that I can see and know exactly what it is immediately without collecting it. Half of them are bumblebees. At this point, I think I can identify most everything to genus, and I guess I can know what I need to see or how what my options are. But yeah, a lot of them are really challenging, and there's no one that really does bees in the sense that people do birds. In terms of, you don't go bee watching and just keep a list as you go. A lot of them you need to collect. That being said, I've been working on a guide to the bumblebees of Vermont, because that is a group that is definitely possible to learn and to identify most of the species by sight or with binoculars or with a camera. So it's on the VCE website. If you find the bee project, val.vt Ecostudies will bring you to the Vermont Isles of Life page, and then there's the bee subpage of that has links to some. We've started making these. I've got a page of all of the invasive species in Vermont, and then all of these a handful of species that I'm calling the most wanted list of things that are either rare or that we want more information on or haven't been found in Vermont yet, but might be here. And I've been trying to make those things that are at least potentially identifiable from photos or in the field. And that, it's slowly developing, but it has some information on identification of these easier ones. Bumblebee, I definitely encourage anyone who's interested in this to start paying attention to bumblebees, especially. There's only 13 species that are present in Vermont right now. Probably only 8 that are very common that you're likely to see in a given year. There's a lot of variation, but even then, they're identifiable with practice, with photos. And there's a lot more resources available for identification of bumblebees.
And I'd second what Spencer said about using iNaturalist as a resource to really start learning these things. And as he pointed out, he and Nathaniel threw up the picture of that one of the cuckoo bees, and I thought it was fascinating. You said the leading bee expert in the nation was on top of that record within a day. And so, whether you're an expert or whether you're a beginner, iNaturalist is a great place to learn new species of any taxa, really.
Totally, yeah. And even if you don't know it's a bee, put up a picture of an insect, call it an insect, and someone will identify it as a bee, and then a bee person will see it and identify it as a sweat bee, and then this guy John Asher will find it and tell you exactly what species it is. And that's the power of it.
Photography, bee photography.
Tips for bee photography, is that the question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Move slowly. Don't be afraid to get close to them. They're not going to sting you if they're just on a flower. You can stick an iPhone up in their face. You can stick a macro lens. And then the other option is to get yourself a net. Even a simple insect net meant for kids works pretty well. Catch bees, put them in clear vials, glass, plastic, any small vial, and then you can hold them and you can look at them closer that way. One thing that has been recommended that I haven't had a chance to play with, but people are using like foam plungers. So put them in a vial and then stick some foam or other soft material in there to pin them against the bottom of the vial so that they stay still, which could be an interesting way to photograph them. But yeah, just find flowers and then wait for the bees to come to you. Sometimes they'll be scared away by quick movements, but if you sort of set up and wait for them to come close, you can slowly move your camera or your phone close enough to get a good shot. Try different angles. Sometimes you need to see a couple different features to identify things.
Cool. Anybody else have any other questions? Spencer, would you mind unpresenting your screen?
I'm trying to figure out how to do that, yeah.
Say it stop presenting in the middle, probably. Anybody else have any other questions? Feel free to throw it in the comment box here before we let Spencer go.
And feel free to reach out via my VC email, which is on the VC page, if you have further questions or want to get involved with this project. We're always looking for volunteers.
All right, well, Spencer, I want to say thanks very much. Emily's reminding me that we have actually, for those of you that want to get involved in iNaturalist, we actually have a presentation coming up next, I believe it's next Friday, April 10th, with North Branch Nature Center, Zach Coda, as well as Vermont Center for Ecostudies,
Sean, can't hear
Emily
you.
Anderson, to give everybody a rundown on how to actually use iNaturalist. So if you're interested in learning your bees and you want to get some practice using iNaturalist, join us a week from right now, same place, same time. So with that, I want to say thanks to Spencer
Sean, we can't
for
hear
joining us
you.
this weekend.
Can't hear you.
Oh, let's see.
I can hear you just fine.
You can't hear me. You can't hear me, Spencer?
I can't. No, I can't. I totally can.
Well, anyway, I want to say thanks to everybody, and thanks to Spencer, and thank you all for supporting North Branch Nature Center, our Resiliency Fund. Thanks for checking out NBNC Online, and please share the love with Vermont Center for Ecostudies as well as you think about how you can engage in nature in the next weeks and months ahead. If you have any further questions, feel free to email me, email Spencer. We are happy to be here for you. Thanks, everybody.
Totally. Thank you, Sean.